at the University of Utah. All right, sorry. Kristen Hawkes is the Distinguished Professor of Anthropology at the University of Utah. Her research has been published in all of the top journals, the premier journals in the sciences, as well as in anthropology. And her work, her pioneering and influential work has been recognized by being elected as a member of the National Academy of Sciences, as a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So she joins a very select group of anthropologists, certainly biological anthropologists, that have been nominated for both of those. I should also add that she has served for a number of years, more than 3 decades, as a scientific executive committee member on the Leakey Foundation. And that's where actually I first met her in person. Of course, I knew her work before that, but that was the first encounter I had with Kristen. So if you're thinking about applying to the Leakey Foundation, or you have applied in the past, you can be pretty sure that Kristen has seen your work and knows your research and will have commented on it. So she probably knows more about our research than most other people out there because she sees so many of the proposals. Her research has spanned anthropology. She has done cultural anthropology. She's interested in archaeology. She's involved in biological anthropology. So, and she's sort of really covered all of the anthropological domains, really. But her most recent work has focused on aspects of life history and the importance of life history that distinguish humans from other primates, because there are many aspects of human life history that are distinctive. I'm sure Kristen will talk about that in her presentation. So, and this work that she's going to discuss, I think, today, has been very much influenced by her fieldwork over the years. She's worked on hunting and gathering societies in South America, in Africa, especially in more recent years with the Hadza in northern Tanzania, a group that's close to my own research area in northern Tanzania. I work in the Eyasi area of northern Tanzania, and I know that Kristen has worked there quite extensively in the past. And it's her appreciation of human life history that humans extend their life history well beyond menopause, that has been very influential in her understanding that grandmothers play a pivotal role in human social behavior and the evolution of human social behavior. And so that certainly will be a theme, I think, of today's presentation. Now, I should just add as a side note, and I was talking to Kristen at the beginning before you joined us, that she was actually due to be with us in New York almost a year ago, in March, and she was going to fly in. And as you know, things went really pear-shaped in New York at that time, and so we had to cancel her at the very last minute. So we're actually very pleased that she's been able to join us virtually from Salt Lake City. And we're really pleased that a year later, we've been able to make it happen. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Hawkes. The title of her presentation today is Ancestral Grandmothers and Human Evolution. So over to you, Kristen.
Thank you, Terry. I'm really glad to see everybody. I'm especially excited to be here for Darwin Day. And so, I don't know, I'm trying to share my screen with you. Are you seeing what is right in front of me and you aren't?
Yes, you're good, Kristen. We're good. We can see it.
Okay, well, part of what I plan to talk about is what I would have talked to you about last year. If only I'd been able to come there. I would love to come back to New York. I lived there for a while, but it's Darwin Day. And so one of the things that is a special interest of mine, especially recently, is what the heck is going on in intellectual history, and of course what happened Well, Terry just did the math. So it's not only Darwin Day for his birth, but also an anniversary of the publication of The Origin, major shift in how we understand the world. And so I'm going to rehearse some of the things that Darwin saw, and then some stuff we've learned since, other really important contributions to how we understand the dazzle of the living world. Mendelian inheritance, it's so hard to believe he didn't know anything about genes. Sex ratios, sexual conflicts, inclusive fitness, these are all things that have come since, but even since those contributions, we know some things that that other major contributors to what we understand about how evolution works. We know more about hominid phylogeny now, and we know some stuff about foraging choices, both among the other living hominids and this particular hominid. I don't know whether you guys can see me, but this unusual ape is, we know more about it too, especially when foraging is the way you make your living. So, let's see. So do I have control over, whoa, how do I do this? I think I'm gonna need some help. So I just tried to advance the slide. Maybe I do it over here.
Yeah, perfect.
That worked?
Yeah, that worked.
Okay, so I'd really like to reverse these things. Let's see if I can. Ooh, you just went away. Is that still working for you guys?
Yeah, that's slide 2 for you.
Okay,
Yeah.
So Darwin, in The Origin, as you all know, and I do recommend, he is amazing to read. A lot of things you'd say, oh, wow, what he thought then, but so many brilliant observations. And of course, he defined natural selection, things that improve your chances of surviving and procreating your kind are the kinds of things that selection is going to favor. And if it doesn't do that, it's going to disfavor them. But he also, in The Origin, he talked about sexual selection, which, and here is a quote from The Origin, which depends not on a struggle for existence, but on a struggle between the males for possession of the females. The result is not death to the unsuccessful competitors, but few or no offspring. Oh, wow, I still can't advance this. This is so bizarre. Sorry, you guys. So when I try to advance the slides, I can't seem to. Megan, can you tell me what I need to be? Oh, it's maybe I can. Is that it? There we go. Sorry, everybody. And he also, this is in The Origin. It may not seem like much, but this turns out to be so important. He said, in the case of animals and plants with separated sexes, and remember, there are a bunch where that's not the case, it is, of course, obvious that two individuals must always unite for each birth. Well, we now draw out of that what is called the Fisher condition and associate it with R.A. Fisher, who was building on Darwin, one of the architects of the modern synthesis, because what Fisher did was put together natural selection and Mendelian inheritance. So there's all kinds of interesting history before the 1930s with the modern synthesis, but Fisher, in this very important contribution, 1930, he said, if we consider the aggregate of an entire generation, each sex must supply half the ancestry of all future generations of the species. So for sexual reproducers, including us, that is now usually referred to as the Fisher condition. It's the thing that helps us understand why offspring sex ratios are so often close to 50-50, and also sometimes why they're not so close. And it also has implications for the effects that sex ratios in the mating ages have on reproductive strategies. So the Fisher condition has been looming larger and larger in how we, over there now, how we understand what's going on. Fisher also he was putting together natural selection and Mendelian inheritance, and he saw that what happens over time in populations is what's left in gene pools. And so he connected demographic thinking about how populations persist. So population age structure was a huge part of how he was laying out these patterns. And in the 1930 book, on page 28, I'm going to underline that, an important page, he defined this concept, a reproductive value, this way. We may ask about persons of any chosen age, to what extent will persons of this age, on the average, contribute to the ancestry of future generations? The question is one of some interest, since the direct action of natural selection must be proportional to this contribution. Hugely important. It's why we take advantage of the renewal equation, why Fisher did. But he went on to say there will also, no doubt, be indirect effects in cases in which an animal, and now I've added this emphasis, favors or impedes the survival or reproduction of its relatives. As a suckling mother assists the survival of her child. So if we use the renewal equation, it's just fertility and mortality. There's no parental care in there. As in mankind, a mother past bearing may greatly promote the reproduction of her children. This is Fisher in 1930. Having said that, he then, oh yes, so let me underline, here is Fisher recognizing how important, at least for this animal, grandmothers may be. But then he went on the very next page. So that was on page 28. Now on page 29, this is a figure in a book. It's figure 2. And he shows the, quote, reproductive value of Australian women. This is in about 1911. And what you see there is reproductive value asymptotes at 0 before the age of 50, something that will turn out to have huge implications. Now, Hamilton, now I'm introducing another major contributor to how we understand how evolutionary processes work. W.D. Hamilton, and can you guys see the top of my screen? I'm seeing some of you, and oh good, so you can. So this is Hamilton 64, so these are famous papers of his, ended up being 2 papers in which he laid out his arguments about how really it's inclusive fitness. That's the key thing we need to understand for a lot of living things. Each organism appears to maximize its inclusive fitness. There's nothing special about the parent-offspring relationship. Opportunities for benefiting relatives, remote or not, must be much more common. So just fertility and mortality is not going to cut it. That is Hamilton in 1964. And then 2 years later, this major additional contribution of Hamilton's, trying to understand how senescence works. So his 66 paper, The Molding of Senescence by Natural Selection, is not about humans in particular, all kinds of other organisms. He lays out a general model and he mathematicizes, produces a formal model for what George Williams had talked about in 1957, and showing that mostly Williams is right, but here is his, then he applies it to humans because, as he says, much the best data are on humans. And here he's using Taiwanese farmers in 1906, pretty good data set. He thought, oh, mortality is high there, so maybe that's a good one to use. Of course, there were no data on people who were foraging for a living. And here we've got Hamilton showing almost essentially the same figure, because once again, reproductive value is defined by mortality and fertility. And so here it's the solid line, that's the females. And here also reproductive value is 0 before the age of 50. And then he went on, because he was doing the whole story, and in his model, the force of mortality should end up resulting in the two things asymptoting in the same place: the end of fertility and where survival asymptotes at zero. Here we're looking at the force of mortality, so death rates. As he says, the rise in mortality, of talking about the human case, in the later reproductive ages of man is by no means asymptotic to the age at which reproduction ends. The rather definite age of the menopause seems to be conspicuously ignored by the as yet gently rising curve of the force of mortality. And if we, and he went on. So, you know, here is Hamilton talking about grandmothers in 1966. It's moreover a matter of common knowledge that the postmenopausal woman, here is one right here, the postmenopausal woman normally remains a useful and healthy member of the community for some time. A woman does sometimes live to twice the age of her menopause. The comparatively healthy life of the post-reproductive woman is so long that it inevitably suggests a special value of the old woman as a mother or grandmother during a long ancestral period. And it's, yeah, and it's maybe easier to see if now, this is his figure 1, where you can see just fertility and survival. And according to the model that he built, those two arrows ought to be in essentially the same place. They're not. And that's what led him to say, maybe grandmothers really matter. Well, that was 1966. He went on to work on some other things. Our grandmother hypothesis, and that word I think is used to mean a lot of different things, but the one that my colleagues and I continue to bet on initially was meant to explain this postmenopausal longevity that characterizes humans, our later maturity and our short birth intervals compared to the other living hominids, to the living great apes. And now so many other things turn out to be connected to this. Our pair bonding, our big brains, all kinds of things about our social appetites. And I'm going to, really quickly whip through some of the relevant data and modeling associated with those things. So this is a story that you all know now as we understand the phylogeny of the family we belong to. It wasn't very long ago that we talked about the pongids, the apes, they're over there, and then there's us, the hominids, but now we know that we're all so closely related that all of us are in the same family. In fact, some of them are closer to us than they are to other great apes. And one of the things that they all share is mothers manage to deal with and raise their infants independently. Not only do they do it independently, but those infants are already starting to feed themselves while they're still nursing. And mom is carrying them along, doing her own work. She's a working mom, feeding herself. And while she's nursing, they are beginning to forage, pick, handle the same foods that she's eating. And then there's us. And this us I'm using as the example. Hadza folks, so modern people, that's all we've got left on the planet is us moderns. But the Hadza, because they managed to make a living on wild foods, they have important things to teach us about that. Not only do they do that, they do it in a habitat that has a lot of the features that seem relevant as we're trying to understand what happened in the evolution of our own human radiation. So my collaborators, Jim O'Connell and Nick Lurton-Jones, started working with Hadza foragers in northern Tanzania. None of us were especially interested in grandmothers, hadn't even probably thought about grandmothers. Are old ladies going to be important? That seemed pretty unlikely. But one of the things that was a special concern at the time among archaeologists was what to make of these assemblages. And there were all kinds of arguments about whether or not they were actually human produced. The earliest archaeology is the bones of large animals and stone tools. And are those animal assemblages, the faunal assemblages, are they produced by ancestors of ours, or is it other carnivores? And so paying real attention to what those assemblages looked like, what was in them, where they were, and so on, was a special focus of my collaborator, Jim O'Connell. He is an archaeologist. He has the eye of an archaeologist. I don't, although I try to follow what archaeologists are paying attention to. But because we were monitoring every single big animal that was taken by the people we were with, it meant that we recorded an enormous data set of how hunters were encountering and succeeding in both scavenging and also taking down the big animals. Now, these are modern people again, and they're using powerful bows and arrows, something that we don't have to go very far back in the archaeological record to say, no tools like that. These guys are modern people using powerful bows and arrows. And our data set showed us that the actual chance of getting a big animal, these guys go out every day. They go mostly one guy at a time. These guys are all sitting there on this giraffe, great success, sitting there for their picture, but they were not all together in killing this giraffe, and they all know who it was who actually shot the crucial arrow. The chance for the average hunter on getting anything is way less than 5% on any day, and they go every day. 3.4% chance of succeeding in getting either a scavenging takeaway from the other predators or a kill on their own. And when they're successful, whoa, it is a big deal. These big animals are huge piles of meat. Everybody hears about it. You can't hide this in this environment. You know, it's like the used car lot, you know, with the balloons overhead, only it's the birds who are circling over carcasses. Everybody comes to the kill site and eats at the kill site, carries meat away. Big deal, bonanza for all, huge important thing, and everybody knows who's responsible. But the capture chance is so low. So what about eating every day? We were, as behavioral ecologists, paying attention to all ages and both sexes, and people were so generous in letting us follow them around and see how they spent their time and what they got for it. So we had data on little kids who, for the kinds of things that people depend on throughout the year, they depend on eating every day. There are things that these little kids just can't manage. They are too small. And that there are some seasons when the berries are in and the little kids can be pretty good at that. But the year-round staple, these deeply buried geophytes, the little kids just can't manage it. So they have to depend on their moms. And we were weighing people so we could actually see the relationship between kids' weight gains and how much their mothers were foraging until mom had a new baby. And then that relationship disappeared. And then the relationship was with grandmothers foraging. Now, those initial results were based on these weight changes. Blurton Johns, my collaborator in this project, has spent decades trying to get the demography figured out. And his book detailing the demographic stuff was published a couple of years ago. And the effects on the survival of little kids, if they have a living grandmother, is marked. It's kids with living grandmothers survive at a rate that's 50% at least higher than those who don't. And the big issue that makes what's going on here have the features that we see is the characteristics of these savanna resources. Now, remember our living cousins, the other great apes, those infants are already starting to feed themselves while they're still nursing. And then they're autonomous feeders when they're weaned. But if you're depending on these resources, little kids can't manage, let alone, infants, but adults get high, regular, every day. You cannot fail. You go out, you will succeed every day. And because of the economics of going for resources like this, your rate goes up as you continue to dig. And so doing them in batches makes economic sense. And the old women add to the size of the batches without adding more little hands and mouths to appropriate from them. So the productivity of the old women is subsidizing the still dependent youngsters. And that means their moms do better by having a next baby sooner. And we were actually seeing in front of our eyes with modern people, this kind of division of labor between women in their fertile years and women who are past it. And so here, coming back to this contrast, makes us say, wow, it looks like maybe what's going on with these old ladies mattered. And there is a Hadza grandmother, actually a great grandmother there, getting ready to go out, and all the grandkids ready and waiting for Graham to get to work. And her daughter, as you can see, has a new baby there. She also is depending on the work of her mother. And when we look at the age structure of human populations, and now I'm using the Hadza to represent us, and what I'm showing here is just the female half of the population pyramid. On the left is a half of the life table built from a half of the age structure built from life tables. This is a synthetic set from 5 chimpanzee populations, but what it's showing, each one of those bars is the fraction of the population in that 5-year age class. So there you can see, and the green bars are the fertile ages. And if you're a chimpanzee female, chances are you're going to die while you're still cycling. It's very rare for a chimpanzee female to outlive her fertility. Fertility ends at about the same age in them and in us, but in us, in human populations, if you make it to adulthood, and there are a lot of populations in the world today where that's pretty tricky, if you make it to adulthood, the chances are way better that you will outlive your fertility. And so what characterizes human populations, and then this is, I'm using Nick's Hadza life tables to build this half of the population pyramid. Those golden bars at the top, the golden ages, about a third of the adult females are past their fertility. Now, at the same time, we were accumulating these results. Eric Charnov, who's a theoretical biologist, was teaching me to be an evolutionary biologist, and I was paying a lot of attention to what he was doing with trying to understand life history evolution, had not even thought that it might help with some of the questions I was interested in. But he was building models to try and explain what might account for the variation in life histories across the mammals. He was interested in other vertebrates too, and differences between birds and mammals and snakes and lizards, but the mammal one is of special interest. And this is a figure that comes from his 93 book, in which he was using primates to show one of the relationships that had really was part of how his modeling had shown a way to account for the variation. And it's showing the relationship between age at maturity, here meaning age at first birth, because this is meant to apply to all the way across the mammals, and versus average female adult lifespan. And you can see there I've marked 2 of the points, which are way up there on the regression, one of them essentially anchoring it. And although they weren't separated out in the figure, that was a time when the other living hominids were called pongids, and then there's humans, and he was using data from Harvey and Cluttenbrock, and for humans, they had used data from Kung-speaking foragers around Dobie, and then categorized the great apes as pongids. And you can see again, there is the relationship. But wow, that human case, what up with that? It is the case, and we, at the end of the 90s, took the best data that were available for these two parameters for other living great apes and humans, and calculated this product, which he had shown to be pretty close to invariant all the way across, from mouse to elephant, the great big variation across the mammals. That product stays about the same, even though the value of the two variables changes enormously. And wow, there it is, humans, absolutely, there it is. And yet in his models, all of adulthood was spent producing babies. Well, what the heck? How does the human one fit? Except that this other invariant of his, alpha B, is the relationship with birth rate. And the expectation is that is also approximately invariant. But when we do that calculation, our alpha B is way off the charts. Our birth intervals are way shorter than what would be expected for a primate of our longevity and age at maturity that wasn't grandmothering. But if what's going on during those post-fertile ages is subsidizing the fertility during the fertile ages, voila. So very exciting to us. It looked like we were onto something that this looks very promising. And then within the last few years, so lucky to have this mathematical biologist, Peter Kim, get interested in the question of taking all the pieces that we just talked about, building agent-based models to simulate, could that really happen? And so a lot of assumptions, as always, built in when you do this kind of modeling, but starting with a great ape-like life history, and that's what's shown in the panel on the left, and running his agent-based model, 30 simulations without any subsidies coming from the females whose fertility was ending. And there were just very few of them, because these were, we were assuming a great ape-like age structure, and run the simulations. And you can see that the ones that don't go extinct maintain that equilibrium for 1 million years. So that's where it sticks. I'm going to talk about those extinctions in a minute. Very interesting that 7 cases actually start to move to increase longevity. That's what's being shown on the vertical axis, but they go extinct. However, if those very few females that are left are allowed to subsidize the dependent youngsters, then that allows the mothers of those youngsters to have the next baby sooner. And what happens with that grandmothering is shown on the right side, 30 simulations with grandmothering. And what you see is once a simulation escapes that basin of attraction, it just does one thing. It moves toward another equilibrium, and one that looks so much like what we see with modern people who are in the kind of mortality regime that you face if you're foraging for a living. And we can actually, I'm up here in the upper left-hand corner, the boys have been added, right? So now not just the female part of the population pyramid, but adding the male side as well. And once again, using Hadza data to represent us, and this synthetic life table for chimpanzees in the green. And what's bracketed there are the fertile ages. And again, fertility ends at about the same age in all of us. but we've talked about those golden years for females. The thing is, we've also now got all these old men. And so one of the things that we can do is take that model of Peters, and instead of tracking longevity, look at the sex ratio in the fertile ages. So it is the case in mammalian reproductive physiology that females tend to have all the oocytes they're ever going to have very early in life, and then they just lose them. Males continue to produce new sperm throughout adulthood. And if we look at this set of simulations, again, without grandmothering, we're kind of stable there at a great ape-like adult sex ratio, which is female biased. Again, this is called the adult sex ratio in the literature because, you know, grandmothering is not very common. And so most of the time, adulthood is spent producing offspring. And then when we have subsidies coming from those older females, what happens is the adult sex ratio shifts from female biased to male biased. And the model values are there in that table. And not surprisingly, those model values are, because we're using the real world to build our models, if we actually do a reality check and we look at these values for the cases where we have data, what we see is, yes, the model and reality seem to be more or less on the same page. So we're getting all these old, still fertile males. And of course, the only way they're going to produce offspring is by getting paternities with the still fertile females. So this complete shift in the sex ratio has a huge consequence. And actually, cultural anthropologists have remarked on this for a long time. This is a quote from Jane Collier, who's a cultural anthropologist who never thought that biology would ever help very much understanding human behavior. But in a book in which she was looking at synthesizing what we see in societies without classes about how marriage works, she said, relations between spouses are best understood in the context of relations between men. Men must assert claims to women in competition with other men. And what we find across the living world is that when sex ratios are male biased, the strategy that tends to win, both empirically and in the various ways this has been modeled, is to guard a mate once you get one. This is a paper in which Ryan Schacht and Adrian Bell considered three possible strategies for males. They could either care for the offspring of their mate, they could guard her, or they could keep moving on and get a paternity from another mate. And what they showed is if paternal care didn't make that much difference, it was always a non-starter. Things went from multiple mating as long as the sex ratio was female biased, because there are more females out there, and then switched when the sex ratio became male biased, because there's all that competition out there. When you got one, hang on to her. And what they showed in that paper was that even if you made paternal care, whoa, hugely effective, double the survival at least, kids cannot die before adulthood, it was still the case that paternal care, if you got to a sex ratio that was male biased enough, would be outcompeted by guarding. So there's that space in the middle where paternal care might hang on, but if the sex ratio gets far enough male bias, then it loses out. And Sarah Liu has taken that question of and shown how sensitive results like these are to what are the chances of a male losing paternity. If he's guarding, is it 100% that he's got absolutely sure any offspring of that female are going to be his? And what her modeling showed was if there's even a small fraction of a chance, then it can mean that the sex ratio can be male biased and still it can be the case that guarding doesn't take over. But as the sex ratio gets more male biased, then even with a toonce of a chance of paternity lost, guarding is the thing that wins. And so here we come back to the picture in the beginning. This Hod's a couple. There he is with his working tools. And there she is with the baby, and the notion that really that's the key to what allows her to have not only this baby, but this little one has an older sister who's barely a toddler, and one above that it was what he was doing that managed it. This now says what he has to worry about is his reputation as a hunter. And that makes it worth it to go out, fail most of the time, because when he's successful, then everybody hears about it. His reputation as a hunter is so important that the other guys pay attention to that. And Matthew Chan, who was postdocing with Peter Kim, instead of an agent-based model, he decided what we need to do is model some of this in other ways, because agent-based models are often kind of black boxy. And what his modeling using differential equations showed, again, with assumptions that we could talk about, was how important both sexual selection and sexual conflict seem to be in propelling the results. Remember those extinctions I talked about? Now we noticed those in the beginning, thought, what's going on there? And it looks like what's happening is in those stochastic models, it could happen that a male with longevity genes happens to be very successful. That can push longevity to higher levels, but without grandmothering, it doesn't work and the population goes extinct. And in Matthew's model, the point, the red arrow on the left shows so we're looking on the vertical axis at what the chances are of where we're going to be in life expectancy, which is on the horizontal axis. And the arrow on the left shows that in without grandmothering, that's where the longevity, the equilibrium would be. But that blue line shows that when you got both sexes in there, it's not really sharp, and the males can really push it a bit. If we look at, if Matthew did this, he looked at what if we just consider the females with grandmothering, what is the optimum longevity? And that's the arrow in the middle. But the one we end up with is the one on the right, because the males keep pushing to a higher longevity. It is advantageous for them in terms of additional paternities. But this longevity thing, which is a huge thing about us, has another set of implications that I have only tumbled to recently. And this is the work of Barbara Finlay, who's a neurobiologist, a cognitive neuroscientist, and long story about how I just happened to cross paths with her. And she and her collaborators for the last more than a couple of decades have been looking at what happens with the development of mammalian brains. And what now they have sampled widely across the mammals. Of course, they haven't sampled every one, but what their data show is that brain size increases with longevity, and the components, so we always talk about our big neocortex, the components scale with longevity. So this figure is showing what they call their event scale. So this is measuring a bunch of things in neurodevelopment. And with increased longevity, ontogeny slowing down, there are more stem cell turnovers before things start to differentiate. And so the stem pool is bigger, stem cell pool is bigger. And so that turns out to be a larger organ as a consequence. And what is shown there is, wow, how it is amazing how regular this is across the mammals. Now they've got more than 270 events in neural maturation that they have measured in the various subjects that they're looking at there. And the story about human brains is our brains are the size that would be expected for a mammal with our longevity, given how mammals build their brains, and the proportion that's neocortex is exactly what would be expected. And here I'm quoting Finlay from a recent paper. Belief that our neocortex is exceptional, quote, has caused both neuroscientists and psychologists to prematurely assign functions distributed widely in the brain to the cortex and to neglect genuinely novel features of human infancy and childhood. And this pattern of, again, in the great apes, those infants are already feeding themselves. Well, nothing close to that in this animal. Infants are far from being able to do anything like that. Our weaning is so early, and yet our brain development is slower. And a crucial consequence of that early weaning, moms have been selected to move on to the next baby, spend less on each because of these subsidies of grandmothers. And this is something that has had the attention of many people, not necessarily looking at from this perspective, but recognizing that this very short interval in which moms have new babies while the previous one is incapable of doing very much on its own. This is a striking feature of our of this animal and our quite recent ancestors. And Sarah Hurdy has used the label. I can't quite see the top of my slide there, but she's used this word, ambivalent mothering, to describe this consequence for human mothers. I'm using a Hadza example and various others for this issue that moms can have multiple dependents, and yet infants come in unable to manage on their own. And the issue for survival for them is to get the attention and the commitment of somebody, this approval of others. Their engagement with infants is a survival strategy in our babies, so different from our, where's my slide thing? What is characteristic of our human populations is, for infants, establishing these relationships are absolutely crucial. Attracting attention. What are you doing? Am I not cute? Ooh, is that, what do you think? Can we be on the same page? The thing about relationships is crucial, not only for infants to survive, but this continues past infancy into childhood. It continues right here on, where our relationships with other people are the most important thing to us. And lifelong continuing concern about what others think, about what their reputations are, what they think of us, what our reputations are. Ooh, is that what you think? Well, I think, well, can we somehow get together here? And being on the same page is something that continues to be hugely important. Oops, I lost you all. Can you still, what happened?
Yeah, no, we can still see your screen.
You can see my screen and I can't. Yeah. Oh, bizarre. Oh, there it is. Okay. So starts with babies, continues this thing about kids with other kids, with slightly older kids, these play groups, many, I mean, now we think of kids going to school and we grade them by, order them by school age and so on, but this is not the characteristic of most of human experience, this multi-age patterns of interaction, but the importance of approval, reputations that are survival issues in infancy, and they continue to be lifelong. So here is a bunch of stuff that I've thrown at you, building on, the amazing thing that happened in 1959, some things that happened before, and then stuff that we've learned since that connect ancestral grandmothering to all these things in human evolution, our distinctive life history, our pair bonding habits, our big brains, our sociality in infants, but lifelong. Right now, I want to know, are you guys on the same page with me? This is hugely important. This is a thing that distinguishes us from our closest living relatives and from all the other animals. And grandmothers look like maybe we can blame a lot of it on them.
All right. I think you're finished there, right? Wonderful. That was really incredible. And we've got time for questions. For those people who've just joined us after my introduction, you can do this two ways, ask questions two ways. You can raise your hand through the like emoji through the reactions panel, or you can put a comment in the chat and we'll read that one out. So questions are open, I think. So if anyone's got a question, we're happy to have Megan moderate for us. Anyone?
May I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go on, go ahead. Is that James?
That was really wonderful. Thank you. My question is whether you have any particular thoughts about why this kind of extended reproductive senescence period has evolved so rarely.
Well, what a good question. I don't dare I call you Jim. I know we have overlapping interest in primates in general. You mean why don't other primates? Is that
well, it's just generally across animals, right? It seems to be really rare. It's maybe a few times in whales, and of course it may crop up more than we now know, but it seems to generally be a pretty rare thing to have happened just a few times in mammals, and why that might be, and some of your thoughts about that.
So one of the things that I meant to put all the pieces there is that where we start out as hominids, and then there's this ecology in which if you're going to invade those spreading savannas, then those are going to be places where infants can't feed themselves. So I'm trying to connect aspects of both phylogeny and ecology, but it's, seems really important. And I think trying to address exactly that question, does it require, we know, for example, that in other primates, grandmothers can make a difference. If a female vervet, for example, in Fairbanks data, other people have it too, maybe you do, Jim, but when a female's mother is still around, that can have a positive effect on all kinds of things about her fitness. She has an ally there, but the sorts of ways in which grandmothers seem to help is not, does not have to trade off against older females continuing to be fertile. And so the notion that there would be any selection for increased longevity is open anyway. If you are eating what, for example, vervets eat, or let's go back to the other apes, if you're a chimpanzee, Or if you're an elephant, elephants have remarkable longevity. And we know some things about how in elephants, those older females have consequences for everybody's welfare in the social group. But what those baby elephants are eating and building those enormous elephant brains is grass, and having somebody stuff more into your mouth is not really going to help. And if you are eating the soft fruits and leaves and so on of that the other great apes eat, having somebody stuff it in your mouth is probably not going to make any difference. So trying to finger these particular things about savanna, these savanna foods, and a reason to think that the hunting doesn't cut it because it's not reliable. So something else has to be the key. I find those cetaceans fascinating, and orcas are the ones we know the most about, but I can get off on questions about those orcas. It is the big males that there's real reproductive skew in those orcas, the big males that get most of the paternities, and the way they live in these matrilineages, and the males go off and mate elsewhere, and other males come in and mate the females and then leave, and then the sons come back. And then there are data suggesting, this is a paper by Brianna Wright and colleagues a few years ago, suggesting that females, showing actually their salmon sharing data showed that females shared more with their big males, and as their daughters started having babies, they shared less with their daughters, they shared with the big males. And their hypothesis was, since those big males get most of the paternities, you keep him really in good nick so he can go off. And then she has all these grandchildren elsewhere that don't compete with the grandchildren in her matrilineage, and raises all kinds of questions for people like me. If that were the case, boy, those males ought to be living a long time. And what the life tables seem to show is that it's the females that are long-lived, and surprisingly, no effect on the longevity of the males. So all kinds of questions about, it's all, I mean, looking at terrestrial animals can be really difficult, but when it's all going on underwater, oh boy, is it difficult. So
yeah,
I don't, do you have any?
and I think it requires relatively low age specific mortality, right? You can't be losing so many every year that I think for many species, like just becoming long-lived is just not really on the cards at all, because mortality every year is so high.
Oh, well, and therefore, and yet we see all this variation in the living period, right? In longevity. And so again, going back to Charnov's models, which were so influential on me, this huge variation across the mammals in what longevity looks like. So, if you're a mouse, then boy, mortality is just so high, you better mature quickly and have as many babies as you can before it's over. But at the other end, the elephant end, you can take your time and get bigger, and then have babies more slowly. And those are the very things he was trying to explain, but he did the thing that leaves the very question you're asking open. What's running adult mortality? Because in his models, the thing that runs the show is adult mortality. And that, of course, was very attractive from our grandmothering perspective, because if given the perspective I was laying out, what happened in our lineage was longevity increased. So this is not the argument that George Williams made in his 57 paper about stopping early. That would imagine we had a longer lived ancestor. I don't know how did that happen? Right? So I'm much more attracted to the way Hamilton ended up posing the question. And again, our modern looking at living people and the trade-offs that seem so evident there. But they're modern people. And then, so I've piled up a lot of things that are consistent with an argument that longevity increased because of the payoffs in terms of producing more descendants, given that this is the ecological situation you're trying to manage. And there are all these other things about, you know, genus Homo gets everywhere all of a sudden, kind of, and that means into all these habitats where, wow, if you're another kind of primate, in a sense, you're kind of tied to places where the infants and juveniles can feed themselves. We tend to think of our expensive children as tying us down, and yet because they are subsidized, it actually allows those tethers to be released. So I'm leaving your question, which is really a good one. And would you say that one of the things that should be on our plate is to, although I kind of prefer models that have fewer things in them at a time because it's easier to tell what you're wrong about, but would you counsel us to try to build models in which both things about the ecology and things about the life history were contributing to what happens? That, you know, we don't have a time machine, so there's the rub, right?
Yeah, I can see lots of questions stacking up here. So let me turn
thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, James. Megan, can you monitor some of the questions from the chat? And I know Paola's got a hand raised.
Yeah, so Paola can go first.
Okay.
Hello. Hi, Professor Hawks. Thank you very much for your talk. It was wonderful. I wanted to ask you whether, like, you have any, you know, thoughts or ideas about when this actually occurred during human or hominin evolution. And I know, like, you know, Kaspari and Lee have argued, for example, that older age kind of becomes a thing during the Upper Paleolithic, and that's also when scholars have argued for actually like a cultural revolution. So do you think those two things are somewhat related to what you were talking about, and like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say that the kinds of hypotheses we're betting on are contrary to Kaspari and Lee. And, you know, we had a reply to Kaspari and Lee, whether or not that was persuasive, I don't know. And I don't know, you know, I know that one of the things Rachel Kaspari and I seem to agree on is there are way more similarities between us and Neanderthals than used to be the story. Given some of the things I was just talking about, my favorite hypothesis is that Neanderthal life histories were not really different from ours. One of our early papers, we suggested, well, maybe there's a difference between moderns and Neanderthals in this. I think we were wrong about that. The big brains, again, given how much I've been influenced by Barbara Finlay, you can't have a brain that big without having a life history in which longevity is substantial. Well, again, if we buy the story that comes from Barbara Finlay. So the kind of argument that we have been favoring, and so, you know, O'Connell was the first author on the paper in '99, associating grandmothering with Homo erectus. And there are reasons, you know, to think this all starts before we really identify Homo erectus. A lot of these things are so, those of you that are paleo people, you know how tricky a lot of this stuff really is in the paleo record, all the parts all the missing pieces. Because of the influence Finlay has had on me, I now think that a real marker of increasing longevity is brain size. And there's been a history in anthropology of talking about encephalization. So body size, brain size relative to body size. And I've been persuaded by Finlay, although other primatologists had come to this already. Some had, Rob Diener, Carl von Schaik for a while, that you have to look at absolute brain size and not encephalization. And from my perspective, that, you know, bodies can vary in all these ways and do, and so you're just throwing noise in when actually using something like cranial capacity is a better measure. And so there is an argument that this kind of thing is is going on with Homo erectus, and then allowing being in all those places which are, you know, colonizing all these habitats is strongly suggests a different kind of foraging. So, and you know, I am a consumer in a sense of trying to follow a lot of the things that population geneticists have been doing recently about all the introgression and trying to see whether whether Neanderthals and Denisovans and the pieces that we have on the table suggest that life history is pretty similar to ours, characterized those cousins as well. And yeah, so my favorite hypothesis pushes it back a long ways.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. That was very informative. Thank you.
What do you think, Paula?
Megan, you're up to find somebody else now.
Megan,
Yeah, great. There's a lot of questions in the chat. First one, can you quantify the fraction of calories consumed by post-weaned youngsters coming from each source, like grandmothers, fathers, grandfathers, etc.?
Ooh, good question. And it is the case that some of my former students and collaborators, you know, in the talk I planned to give last year, when I wasn't talking about Darwin, was going to talk about this work in South America, which is what first made me see what men are doing is not provisioning their mates and offspring. But my collaborators in that work they're on another page. We favor contrasting hypotheses, and one of the things that Hilly Kaplan has tried to calculate, and his calculations have been very influential, is average, what on average is produced in terms of calories by different ages and sexes, and what is consumed. And the latter, he estimates by some things about body size and so on. I am not persuaded. So, you know, he's frequently quoted for that figure, whatever it is, 14 billion calories it takes to raise a human to productive independence. I mean, maybe some of you know that better than I. And I think that's a very misleading number. If we look at the Hadza, for example, or the Aceh, who I was talking about before, if you average over the year, meat is a huge proportion of everybody's diet. I mean, in the case of the Hadza, those big animals, it's huge amounts of meat. Everybody chows down. It's a huge fraction of the diet. And so if you average overall, then the thing that is the problem every day is that you got to get, you know, lunch, and the kids have to eat. And that's more important for depending on how little you are. And so my complaint about that averaging is it ignores what I was just talking about, plus the fact that the big animals, and this was, you know, the initial observations among the Aceh, but boy, in spades among the Hadza, that most of the meat goes to somebody else. So it doesn't go to your own wife and kids. In fact, the share they get is, you know, no different. And, you know, women with kids who are not married, they are in there getting just as much as anybody else. Men who are terrible hunters and who go every day and they still don't really succeed very often, it's still the case that their households get shares. So so it depends on how you would want to calculate that, I guess. And then if you did, so maybe I should ask you that question. How would you like to see that calculated?
So Kristen, this is Paul Bingham. I asked the question. What I'm really after is the text question, the chat question. I'm the one who asked it, so I presume you're addressing me with the question. So
I guess,
I- what we're really after here is cause and effect, right? Are grandmothers the primary effect that drives human divergence from other animals? Or are they an effect of some other cause that's driving the divergence of humans from other animals? And so part of what I'm looking for here, so one thing that humans do conspicuously is that the scale of their social cooperation is massively magnified, independently of kinship, something non-human animals don't do. And so what you might imagine here is that grandmothers are one element of that, but the other parts of the cooperation, the cooperative enterprise, would be feeding these youngsters in addition to grandmothers. That was the gist of the question. And so I guess I'm asking, do you have a feeling for what the answer to that question is?
well, first of all, I'd say, I know that one of the ways the cultural transmission people want to characterize a lot of what we try to understand about ourselves is mostly Holocene stuff, in which, and I think we got we got to be this animal way before the Holocene. And it is the case that we know among foragers all over the world that the people you happen to be with right now are not only your close kin, and that the local groups tend to form and reform and change. And I think I'm still not really addressing your question, but one of the papers that Nick worked on was to see whether or not in the Hadza case, whether the post-fertile women, did they tend to go to the places where their being there was likely to make the most difference. And the reason this is especially interesting is that grandmothers could be, completely erasing their tracks. If you've got two daughters and one of them is kind of in trouble and, she's really, her kids aren't doing too well, and another one seems to be doing fine, and you go to help to join in with, live with, reside with the one who's kind of in trouble. And then we go back and compare the case where grandma was there and where she wasn't. It would look like, hey, that didn't matter. It didn't make any difference. And so, erasing her tracks. On a day-to-day, our measures like survival and weight gain and so on, those are more immediate. If what you wanted to know, so let's see. I mean, everybody eats meat when there's meat, man. Even babies, because you masticate the meat and kiss feed the babies, so it's not as though you needed weaning foods or something. So there's a lot of meat being eaten, but there are long stretches of time when there isn't any. And well, so there we go. Do we use averages? I mean, some of the early work that we did, mostly it was ignoring the variance, and it was just looking at averages and comparing, well, for example, strategies for men. Would they, let's suppose they wanted to feed their families, what alternative would give them the highest rate for that? And just looking at averages and ignoring the variance. So again, maybe back to the way you asked the question, or the way I was still not quite hearing the question, what measures would you want to see? So I think what we're doing now, all you guys are, way over there. Some of you I don't know. We're still interacting in all these ways. That is a thing that we can do now. If we want to understand how we got to be this animal, the ways we do this now are really interesting and especially important for the future. And so I probably would want to throw in a thing about what COVID has shown us about how dependent everybody is on inputs from others, which maybe was part of your point. But if we're trying to figure, if you will accept, at least as a working proposition, that we got to be this animal long before agriculture, long before domesticates. And so it's in the context of making a living right here on the stuff that's growing and and the animals and plants that are right here. And so that's a reason why having the chance to, wow, the experimental opportunity of seeing how does that really work is so important. And of course, those chances are disappearing. Now, the case of the Hadza is so different now from when we collected most of our data in the 80s and early 90s, and things are not as they were.
I've got it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Now we're going to put you on the spot a bit though, Kristen, because you've got questions from two of our archaeological colleagues, Alison Brooks and Dominic Stratford. I think we've got time to squeeze their questions in. Okay, Megan, over to you.
Yeah, so I guess the first one from Dominic is, thank you for the talk, Kristen, and can you think of any ways we can spot grandmothers in the archaeological record?
Well, my workaround with all of these things is, as what all of you guys probably do different things and you run across this all the time. The thing I really want to measure, I can't. So how can I index it, right? And it's, so this argument about brain size looking like a remarkable predictor of longevity seems to me very cool, and something that is a thing that we can use in the deeper record. There are these features of life history that have seemed like they might help us. For example, weaning age. So it is a striking thing about us, especially if you do the allometric calculation, how early we wean kids compared to the other living hominids. And in principle, that's something you can see in the teeth. So I think, well, the Kaspari and Lee question earlier, what they were thinking is you can take these skeletal assemblages and use them to estimate something about age structure. And they took a cool step, because they said, well, we got to consider the M3 and versus the M2, and they tried to do things like that. But given that we have these life history models that link all those pieces together, there seemed to be a problem with what they were doing. And again, I think actually maybe Rachel Kaspari and I are closer together now on this question of how really different are Neanderthals from moderns. So how do you recognize grandmothers in the archaeological record? In our lineage, brain size seems like a good marker of longevity. Well, I don't know. I guess it would depend. If you want to construct a model that said, we got longevity some other way, and then there was an advantage to stopping birth early or something like that. So I guess it would depend on what kind of assumptions you wanted to make, how you built your model, and what kind of hypotheses it could give you. This is the problem, isn't it? We want to know about a different past. We are stuck in the present, and we want to know what happened in a different past. But on Darwin Day, we want to remember, wow, look how far you can get with having some serious theory. I probably should have underlined that at the end. Anyway, so please, whoever asked that question, Megan, who was it that asked?
That was Dominic Stratford.
So Dominic, do you want to push me on that?
Hi, Kristen. No, thank you very much. I was just wondering about some of your interactions with the Hadza. Can you hear me?
Now I can.
Okay.
Lost you for
Yeah, thank you very much for the answer. I was wondering whether or not through interactions with the Hadza, then you'd seen any specific material cultures that grandmothers were sort of producing, or how they might fit in, or how we might spot material cultures related specifically to grandmothers.
So I was having trouble hearing you, but it sounded like your question was, is there any material culture that would be especially we could associate with grandmothers? And actually the first paper we wrote about the yes, Fred, So great to see you. Um, the first paper about hardworking Hadza grandmothers, what came out of the data was so surprising that actually the old ladies, their return rates digging for these tubers were essentially the same as the women in the childbearing ages. They just spent more time at it. So their tools, their working tools are digging sticks, just like the younger women. And so I can't think of anything, at least in my experience. So maybe somebody else could be more helpful than I can.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more quick question, actually. Megan, can you?
Yeah, what was Allison's question? I don't see her there, but great that you're here, Allison.
She had two questions, but I don't think we're going to have time to get to those. But maybe Megan can dig in. It's before the Dominic question, actually.
Sure.
6:01.
Yeah, Allison, do you have a preference of which of your questions?
Don't know if Allison's still with us. So.
Okay.
How about the second one?
Oh, there you are.
Okay, great. So the second one says, if those deep tubers have to be cooked for kids to be able to digest them, what is the fiber content and how does it affect digestibility?
Oh, what a good question. And Allison will know that there's been this back and forth with Margaret Schaininger. We've been trying to figure out, so Margaret Schaininger is, well, I guess would we say she's an archaeologist, but she's been really interested in what actually can you get out of things like with this tuber, and her samples are way off the charts compared to ours or Annie Vincent's or Alyssa Crittenden's. And one of the things that she's argued is there's way so much fiber that this is a problem. In fact, I don't even think that she thinks cooking would help. So let me take two parts of that question. One is, I think, Allison, cooking is a huge deal. And, you know, one of the things that we've been trying to work out on is the role of fire. Lots of reasons to think that fire was a big deal in our ancestry, and that the ways in which we got to be the quote pyrophilic primate was because of more landscape fires, seeing the effects of those, and then beginning to do what actually birds can do, which is move that fire along to burn more elsewhere, try to get some better data on how we might have gotten into the cooking things. I think Richard Wrangham has made such a persuasive case about the morphology that characterizes us is a big giveaway for how important cooking has been in our evolution. I have found his work and Rachel Carmody's work so useful in that question. So I think fire is a big deal. It is the case that you can eat some of those without cooking them. I mean, I have people who say, oh, they're terrible. Really? I mean, no, it's not. It depends. The thing is, if this is what you do, they are so variable. And the people who do it all the time, they know how to distinguish among the ones that are going to be better than others. And it is the case that often there is this quid that you chew it up and then spit out the quid. And if we were talking about really little kids, although I never saw this, I always saw little kids just climbing right in when they had a chance to get their share of those tubers. So I think you could, but even with an infant, it's just like with meat, you could do the kiss feeding. So let's see if I can find my way back to your question. It was about whether little kids could actually eat those things without cooking. Was that it?
Well, it's really, do they get enough nutrition vis-a-vis the fiber out of the deep tubers? If they're very fibrous, do they get enough nutrition to really provide them with calories over and above the calories needed to process them?
Right. Well, again, you know, watching people who are energetic, and the little kids are as energetic as can be. Although, you know, many of them have, you can sort of see that stomach, and going back to early work, looks like in some cases it's worms, but often it isn't. And when we were first starting this Hadza project, Montague Demet, who's a fiber guy, he actually, ruminants are a thing he works on, although he worked on primates, some of whom do that. And he was imagining, oh, couldn't you go out there and, you know, give people barium enemas and put up an X-ray so we could see what's going on in their guts? Because, you know, people do have kind of thicker mid something. And these are all questions that need better data, but the kind of diet that you eat all your life has lots of effects on lots of things, just like your chewing muscles and so on. Those are all affected by what you continue to do. And one aspect of these tubers that's been increasingly of interest, and Allison, I don't know whether you worked on any of this, but you probably know more about it than I do, is how much the microbiome actually affects what you get out of them. So what can be measured is just what's in the small intestine, and then actually Stephanie Schnorr has just measured the only one of those fractions, I forget. But then now I'm understanding things about how important a microbiome is on what you actually get out of what you eat. And there are some data showing distinctive features of Hadza microbiomes. So, but the kids when we were in the field, the kids were, you know, they were certainly doing fine. And
okay, well, we've actually run out of time. It looks like people are already peeling off to go and forage themselves. So it just remains for me to thank Kristen for a wonderful talk. Thanks everyone for great questions as well. And it's been a real pleasure having you visit us virtually in New York. Thank you, Kristen.
Oh, thank you all. Wow, I wish I were there so we could all go have a drink together and talk about this.
Yeah, well, I'll have a glass of wine for you right now.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. Goodbye, everyone. We'll see you at our next event. Bye, everyone.
Australia, rats. Yeah, okay, well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.